My name is Scott Ludlam. I'm one of your Australian Green senators, and would like to kick off the evening as we normally do by acknowledging that we are on Aboriginal ground, that we're meeting here, and pay our respects to elders past and present. We're here tonight to talk about climate change and particularly about what 2011 is going to bring, and we thought it would be a very useful way to wrap up 2010, which has been an extraordinary year. The climate hasn't featured as much in the kind of front lines of public debate as much as it probably did during the 2007 election campaign, where you could argue that, in fact, it was one of the issues on which the 2007 election campaign turned. This federal election was very different, but climate change is with us, and it's with this generation, it's with the coming generation, and every election will turn on climate and energy issues to some degree until we get it sorted. So we thought it would be really useful to talk about what did happen this year, even though some of it went a little bit under the radar, at a state and federal and global level. Tonight I'll concentrate mainly on the new Climate Change Committee and provide a little bit of context as to why that is important, particularly for the next 6 or 7 months. But we've also got two of your Greens state MPs here, Alison Zamon MLC and Robin Chappell MLC, who will fill in some of the state political context, and we've got some very sharp industry folk here and some folk from civil society, climate-related groups as well. So it's a fairly diverse panel. We would like to kick off with a message from somebody who really would have loved to have been here, and that's Senator Christine Milne, my colleague from Tasmania, who's the Australian Greens climate change spokesperson. They're running these fora similar to this around the country, and she would have loved to have been here. So I'm going to, hopefully, if the technology is willing, play you a very brief message of introduction from Christine, and then we'll take it from there.
Hi everyone. Thank you very much for coming to this meeting, because I know how concerned you are about climate change. I'm Christine Milne, Greens Senator and Deputy Leader of the Australian Greens, but more particularly the person with courage of delivering a carbon price mechanism in Australia. This is something the Greens took to the federal election. The other parties didn't want it, and it was effectively the price of government for Julia Gillard that we have a climate committee to deliver a carbon price. But we have to make sure that this time we get an effective mechanism, one that addresses the scientific challenge. And at the moment, we are being told that the pledges on the table in Cancun will give us 4 degrees of warming. So we have to lift our ambition. Secondly, we have to make sure that whatever we do addressing climate change actually transforms the Australian economy. And that's where we differ so much from the other parties who want to do very little and want to buy cheap permits from overseas so we don't do anything here. So our task is to get out there and say, high ambition leads to transformation, leads to a healthier, happier life, a better society. We will have public transport, we'll have renewable energy, energy efficiency. It could be fantastic. Key questions to discuss are, 1, how high does the price need to be to really address the science and to get the transformation in the economy to the renewables and the low-carbon economy? Secondly, how broad is the coverage of a carbon price mechanism? Thirdly, who gets compensation? Every cent that goes in compensation to coal-fired generators is a cent that isn't there to go to R&D, to go to investment in the grid, all the things that need to happen. And finally, once you've decided on the compensation, who gets the rest of the money? And of course, we want to see that money going to Fast Start Finance, our international obligations, plus these issues of transformation, research and development, investment in that low-carbon economy. So good luck with your discussions, but please go out there in the community and campaign for high levels of ambition and the opportunities that bringing a carbon price to this economy will create in jobs and new investment and manufacturing and a better life. Thanks very much.
Okay, so she's effectively framed up the themes that we wanted to present this evening. I'm just going to dip these a little bit so that you can see stuff a little bit better up there. And the word that I'll come back to a couple of times is ambition. is the idea that we've pursued a path so far in climate policy in Australia which the major parties have effectively framed the debate as being what is the minimum that we need to do to take this off the political radar? What, in the context of the challenges that are overtaking us in climate policy, how much do we have to announce in solar panel funding? And how many photo ops in the course of an election campaign should feature a wind turbine? And that is politically probably quite expedient, and it's served the major parties very well up to now, but it's effectively a form of political and economic suicide in the longer term, because it means the situation is getting away from us, and the time that we have to take dramatic action has now become very short indeed. So that's why we called it Turning Up the Heat in 2011, because in many ways, federally at least, 2011 is going to be a crunch year. It's going to be something of a turning point. I don't want to put up a whole pile of graphs and charts and computer models and tables and stuff. So I'm going to play you by way of introducing the topic of why we're here and what the challenge is. Before we get into the politics, I wanted to just spend 30 seconds not talking about the planet. Some of you might have seen this animation before. This is a satellite that's been parked over the North Polar ice cap since 1979, and it shoots one frame each month. And what you'll see, because the North Polar ice is actually sea ice, it floats, the little red dots are marker buoys, and they float around as the ice moves. And the colour coding in the map tells you the age of the ice. So white is very thick pack ice that's been there for years, if not decades or centuries or longer. And the gradations of blue fading away to deep blue show you ice that's thinner and younger and more fragile. So I'm not going to talk, I'm just going to play it. Watch what has happened to that 8 million square kilometres of polar ice cap since 1979. It's 2007. So there's 3 and a bit years, 4 years now, since that frame was shot, and since then we've had, I think, 2 of the warmest years on record. So the pictures, if when we finally get the updated frames, aren't going to bring any cheerful news. That white mirror is what was keeping the ice on Greenland, which is perched ice, it's not floating, millions of cubic kilometres of ice. That's what's kept that together. And now that ice cap is no longer acting as a mirror reflecting that light back into space. It's putting the blowtorch onto Greenland, which is coming apart much, much faster than computer models predicted that it would. The computer models actually predicted that this would happen, but they gave it 100 years, and it's happened in 25 or 30. So the models that they wrote in the early 1990s to try and figure out what the planet was doing got it effectively right, but they were out by a factor of a century or so. And that is how much time we have left. This process, many scientists believe, is reversible because it's sea ice. If you cool the planet and get some of the CO2 out of the atmosphere that we've already put there, get things back to approximately where they were in the mid-1970s, that's the degree of overshoot, then that sea ice comes back very rapidly and takes the blowtorch off Greenland, which means we're saved from the worst of the sea level rises. But that has happened already against the backdrop of an approximately 0.6 degree overall global temperature, surface temperature rise. But the heat is much, much more on the polar ice caps than it is in the mid-latitudes, even though we've obviously noticed it right here in the southwest of WA. That is what we have done in about 100 years. And that is the sense of the urgency. So I wanted to show you that and try and maintain that image in your head if you can when we're considering the politics and the rather miserable state of the debate here in Australia and elsewhere. So there's something that you don't see every day. That was one of my proudest moments post-elections, as Senator Bob Brown and Christine Milne, who's our climate change spokesperson, had the idea before the election. Christine spent a bit of time in Scandinavia. The idea where a parliamentary committee wouldn't just be a bunch of hacks sitting around, but you invite your expert witnesses onto the committee with you. And so this is a deliberative panel which has been designed to see if there can be an accord with members of parliament across all political parties who are interested to see whether an agreement can be reached on a carbon price. So on a market instrument, which won't build a single solar panel, it's a market instrument which says, if I can get fined $50 for littering, then maybe companies should be fined $35 a tonne for dumping this pollution into the air. Maybe that shouldn't be free anymore. And that's the essence of a carbon price instrument. It gets very, very complicated from there, but that's the underlying simplicity. And that was the press conference at which that committee was announced. It was a condition of our support for Gillard to form government. So that was one of the things that we said, given how badly the CPRS debate had played, that we wanted on the table. I won't go through the list there, but the membership is cross-party. The Liberals were invited to put two members up, as were the Nats, and they said they would prefer not to. That's their call. So at the moment, because the two preconditions were, A, you need to believe that climate change exists and that humankind has something to do with it, and secondly, that some form of market price instrument is going to be necessary and is a good way, one of the avenues, one of the pathways towards dealing with the challenge. They couldn't cop it, so they're not there, and good riddance to them, I say. Are we recording? Yeah, we are. In addition to the parliamentary membership, you've got your expert advisors, and there's 4 of them, and a couple of them you probably recognise. Will Steffens, one of the best climate scientists in the country from ANU. Ross Garnaut's name is probably pretty familiar to most as an economist who's tried to grapple with the issues. Mr Sims and Ms Faulkner bring economic and industrial expertise and social expertise, respectively, to the task. So they're 4 members of the committee. First met this October, Thursday, 7. And they meet monthly until the end of 2011. And their job is to come up with a model that can go to Cabinet and then be legislated for before the end of next year. That is effectively the task. And that, I think, in itself is a bit of an achievement, considering the miserable state of politics after the CPRS crashed. So that's something that probably wouldn't have happened under an Abbott government. The purpose, these notes are pinched from the first communique. Committee members reiterated their commitment to work cooperatively across party lines, considering all options for price on carbon. It sounds cheerful and collaborative, and I'm not sure that it has been. The risk, of course, to the process is the usual ones, and it's the risks that Christine outlined in her brief statement, is that what will happen to this is exactly what happened to the CPRS, that the industries and the vested interests who stand to gain from things staying more or less exactly as they are will put their hands up and say, yes, there should be a carbon price and we shouldn't pay it, which is what happened to the CPRS debate, which was why we ended up with more than $20 billion worth of handouts. Coal industry got what they asked for, so did the oil industry, so did the gas industry. You had a carbon price in the end, in that model, that nobody paid, except for us, because our electricity bills went through the roof. And obviously the risks are the same with this, so none of them have gone away. The same interest groups that Professor Garnaut warned about have swarmed into the process and have got themselves on their own little select committee. But we have to have our eyes open to it, and we have to push back, because that is obviously a political and an economic issue. That is the risk. And the political risk to us is that we will be presented with what we were presented with in a political level during the CPRS debate, when the whole thing blew up in their faces and the Liberals disintegrated and Labor was left standing there with this thing that nobody wanted to pass. They came to the Greens, whacked it on the table after a year of refusing to negotiate with us, and said, there you go, pass that, take it or leave it. We have concerns, obviously, that we'll be left in a very similar position with this instrument, however it falls out. And that is more or less exactly the purpose of this evening, is because we're going to need your help as civil society actors, as representatives of business interests with a very strong interest in us getting this right, and as human beings and people with kids. We're going to need probably more help than we got during the CPRS debate, where half of the climate change movement came at us and said, pass this, it's better than nothing, and of course it wasn't. We could very well, by the middle of next year, be confronted with exactly that same situation again. So we need to be bold, because we really only get one shot at this. This has been called the decision decade. The decade between now and 2020 is the decade in which we will pass the thresholds, according to some climate scientists, beyond which the map that I showed you at the beginning of the North Polar ice cap, there won't be a great deal we can do about it. We set in train the melting of the perched ice sheets, hundreds and thousands of cubic kilometres of ice. You can't get that back. You can't scoop that ice and put it back on the continental land masses of Greenland and Antarctica. We need to be bold, and we need to do it now. I love this little quote from Machiavelli, because we are actually trying to turn the ship, and there are a lot of hands on the wheel trying to keep the course that we have at the moment. And what we were presented with last year, and what the risk is that we will be presented with again this year, is a proposal to smash the ship into the iceberg 5% slower than we're going now. That is not acceptable, and we won't be passing anything of the sort. So let nobody say this will be easy. That's the Gladstone refinery in Queensland. But also let no one will say that it will be impossible. It would take 4 utility-scale baseload solar thermal plants of that kind of scale, that's 2 kilometres across, to power an aluminium smelter and produce aluminium using sunlight. And if we can work out how to do that, not in an engineering sense because it can be done, but in a finance sense of enabling the company that produces that stuff, which we need. Anybody who had a can of beer in the last 6 months appreciated our use of aluminium, that company would then be running a smelter on sunlight at no fuel cost, apart from a big team of people cleaning mirrors. That's the challenge that's in front of us. 4 of those plants. For anybody, the slide previously was a computer graphic. This one is not. This is a plant in Spain. It's only 11 megawatts, but they're busy expanding them. This one is 150 megawatts, and it has storage so you can run it after dark or on a cloudy day. That technology exists. They're rolling these out in California and in Spain right now, and other people around the world are experimenting with them. And we still, in our political culture, have a bunch of very, very senior people who should know better running around saying, can't be done. Renewables can't do baseload. What are you going to do when the sun goes down? Well, that is what you're going to do when the sun goes down. We can actually build this technology, and we've long passed the time where we need to have patience with people who say that it can't be done. Anybody who's not seen this gorgeous little document, I think one of the more important pieces of work that was done this year, it's ambitious to the point of being reckless, but it's written by technologists and engineers who say, could we actually run a zero emissions electricity sector, and how long would it take if we gave it the priority that we think it deserves? And the answer is you could do it in 10 years. Using technology that's commercialised today, or so close to commercialisation on a very large scale that you can reasonably accurately model the economics. So if there's one thing or 2 things that you get to take away tonight is please visit that website, grab a copy of the report, they show how to do it. In an engineering sense, a technology sense, they don't answer the political questions of do we care enough to go down this track and build this stuff and get on with it. That, of course, is our challenge in this room. A couple of other groups that I'll give a shout out for very briefly before I sit down, folk who are here tonight, who have done that kind of work that was done by the BZE folk and have been beavering away at this on a state level for a couple of years, are the Sustainable Energy Now, who you'll hear from Steve fairly shortly. And of course, you'll hear from Professor Ray Wills, who will talk about what the Sustainable Energy Association of Australia, based right here in Perth, are doing. And these are real people with real projects and real ideas for how to do it here in Western Australia. So this is not some kind of expertise that we're importing from Melbourne or from California. We can do this here. So that's my favourite quote, and the folk who work with me are probably really quite sick of seeing it turning up in presentations. But there you go. I actually believe that it's entirely true. We do not have an engineering challenge or a technology challenge before us. We have a very, very serious political and economic challenge in front of us. And I guess the fact that we've nearly filled the room tonight is a bit of a sign that people are interested in engaging with that. So thank you very, very much for coming along. I will perhaps, unless Eloise shakes her head furiously, I will call up our first panel speaker. Is that what I'm doing? Great, excellent. So I'll call up Professor Ray Wills to give us a couple of minutes of the benefits of his very practical expertise. Please welcome Ray Wills.